If there is evil in this world, it lurks in the hearts of men.
Uh-oh, this isn't a good sign. Hey everyone, Darren here, and welcome to the third part of my Tales of Retrospective. However, this particular review will be a bit different from my last two. It's actually going to be a lot more negative, but before I get too deep with that, I gotta go over some background information on Tales of Phantasia. Tales of Phantasia is actually the first installment of the Tales series. It originally released in Japan late in the Super Famicom's life in 1995. 3 years later, Phantasia was remade using an enhanced version of the Tales of Destiny engine for the PlayStation 1. This version sported slightly improved graphics and sound, along with a bevy of new content, like a new playable character and many other improvements. Many consider this to be the definitive version of the game. Unfortunately, as its original Super Famicom counterpart, it is exclusive to Japan. North American gamers wouldn't get a chance to play the game in English until the PlayStation version was then ported to the Game Boy Advance in 2003 and published by Nintendo in areas outside of Japan. Now, with that bit of history out of the way, I can finally start today's review of Tales of Phantasia for the Game Boy Advance. As I mentioned earlier, Tales of Phantasia is the first game of the Tales series, making it quite odd that it's the third game to see a Western release. And I can hardly begin to describe how incredibly disappointing that this version of the game is the only one to have an official release in English. Why is that? It's actually a simple answer. The port's terrible. It's god-awful. In fact, it may be one of the worst ports of a game I've ever played. I'll explain why this port is so bad in a minute, but first, I need to establish that Tales of Phantasia is an incredible game, and easily one of my favorite entries in the entire Tales series. It has great music that still holds up, for the time great graphics, and it also had an excellent story with many dark turns and serious themes, coupled with a great cast of characters. Tales of Phantasia is an excellent game that is best experienced either on the Super Famicom or on the PlayStation 1. Because of the terrible porting job, I feel it's not fair to review Phantasia overall, since it's the port that's terrible and the game that's actually really good. So instead of talking about the game formally like I normally do, I won't be talking about the characters or the story. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on the failings of this Game Boy Advance port. I hope to give Tales of Phantasia a proper review in the future. But right now, I need to destroy this game. To begin, let's talk about the one good thing about this port, the graphics. The sprites look similar to the PlayStation version, although they look a little washed out. Overall, the game looks consistently good, but never great. There are definitely prettier games on the Game Boy Advance. And this will be where my praise for the game will end. Now let's talk about the sound. Once again, I have to butcher the names Motoi Sakuraba and Shinji Tatsuma, who composed the wonderful music of the original game. Unfortunately, this port's audio is rather underwhelming. Although the Game Boy Advance was never known for its sound capabilities, this port's audio is still rather lackluster. Borderline terrible at times. The music itself is still great, but it definitely sounds flat and not anywhere near as good as the Super Famicom version or the PlayStation version. Here's an example of what I mean. Hey, remember the battle cries and grunts that everyone hated in Tales of Eternia? Well, since no one enjoyed them, they're back again and worse than ever. Honestly, did anyone realize how terrible they sound? Is it even necessary? The quality of these sounds are absolutely terrible, and it really gets grating since combat is unresponsive and plays out in 10 frames per second. Yeah, so far I've neglected to mention the worst part of this port, the combat. Battles are regularly filled with lag and frame rate drops. Gameplay is the real deal breaker here. I honestly wouldn't mind this port at all if the gameplay wasn't lag ridden. But I simply cannot enjoy this game when I have to go through unresponsive combat after random encounter after random encounter. It's unbearable. If the game could hardly run, I really wonder why they wouldn't try to port the Super Famicom version of Tales of Phantasia. You see, Square Enix ported the Super Famicom versions of Final Fantasies 4, 5, and 6, and they turned out rather well. Namco should have ported the Super Famicom version. It still looks and sounds great, it probably would have run much better as well. I hate to be so negative, but it had to be done, as I feel the Game Boy Advance port of Tales of Phantasia nearly ruins the excellent experience that this game can provide on the Super Famicom or the PlayStation. I'd highly recommend playing those versions over this. Fortunately, both the Super Famicom and PlayStation version have seen full fan translations, and please go support those translations and experience the game that way. Well, that's all I really have to say about Tales of Phantasia for the Game Boy Advance. Stay tuned for the next part of the retrospective in which things will finally get positive again, as I review my favorite game of the Tales series, Tales of Symphonia. Till next time.